The sun always rose the same way on Willow Bend Lane. Golden light washing over neat lawns, white fences, and identical mailboxes that stood like obedient soldiers. It was the kind of neighborhood that looked peaceful from the outside. But behind its manicured symmetry, the HOA rules ruled with iron precision. Every blade of grass, every color of paint, every sound after 9 p.m. was regulated. To live there was to exist quietly, without question, and without deviation. When Thomas Granger moved into the small brick house at the end of the cul-de-sac, no one noticed much. He was a quiet man in his early 40s, reserved and polite, the kind who waved to neighbors but never lingered for conversation. His house stood slightly apart from the others, with an old oak tree that reached over the roof like a hand offering shade. What the neighbors didn't know, or didn't care to ask, was that Thomas had once lived here with his wife, Claire. She'd been the one who loved the oak tree, the one who had insisted they buy the house 10 years earlier because it felt alive. But after her sudden death 2 years ago, the home had become a museum of her memory. Quiet, untouched, and hollow. Every evening, Thomas sat in the same armchair by the window, staring out at the empty driveway where her car used to be. The silence was heavy, the kind that filled the walls until it began to hum. He went to work, came home, and tried to forget how still everything felt. It was on a rainy Thursday that everything began to shift. As he left work, he heard faint whimpers from a cardboard box near the parking lot dumpster. Inside was a trembling puppy, muddy, thin, with eyes that carried both fear and hope. Thomas hesitated, knowing that his HOA didn't allow pets under any circumstances. But when the little dog looked up at him and rested its head on his shoe, the decision was made. That night, the tiny creature curled up on Claire's old blanket beside the fireplace. For the first time in months, Thomas didn't feel the heavy silence pressing on him. The house felt alive again. Over the next few days, life found color once more. Thomas named the puppy Max and spent his evenings walking him under the streetlights. The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Lang from across the street, Mr. Peters with his perfect hedge, and of course, the HOA president, Linda Barker. Linda was the kind of woman who saw the neighborhood as her kingdom. Her floral blouses and clipboard were as much a part of her identity as her unyielding smile. To her, rules were sacred, and Thomas, with his small forbidden companion, had just broken one. The first notice came within a week. A crisp white envelope, tucked neatly into his mailbox. HOA violation. Unauthorized pet immediate action required. Thomas stared at the letter, then at Max, who wagged his tail, unaware of the trouble his existence had caused. He thought about ignoring it. Maybe they'd forget. But 2 days later came another envelope, this one firmer in tone, demanding compliance. He tried to reason quietly, sending an email asking for a temporary exemption, explaining that the dog was harmless. No response. Instead, the third letter arrived, final warning. Failure to comply will result in fines and legal action. Thomas felt the familiar weight of loss return. The HOA didn't know why he'd taken in Max. They didn't know that Claire had always wanted a dog, that she'd begged for one before she got sick, and that he'd always said no because of the HOA's rules. Now, keeping Max wasn't just defiance, it was redemption. It was his way of finally saying yes to her, even after she was gone. That weekend, he walked Max like usual, down the winding sidewalk past perfectly trimmed bushes and identical doors. Some neighbors looked away, others whispered, but he kept walking. He wasn't ready to give up. What Thomas didn't realize was that Linda Barker had already made it her mission to restore order. She had taken photographs, filed complaints, and even brought up his case at the last HOA meeting. To her, this wasn't about a dog, it was about control. That night, a storm rolled over the neighborhood. Rain lashed against windows, thunder echoed through the streets, and as Thomas sat inside with Max asleep beside him, he felt something inside himself solidify. For years, he had followed every rule, paid every fee, stayed quiet while others enforced their petty power. But not this time. The next morning, as the storm cleared and sunlight spilled across the lawns, Thomas stepped outside and pinned something to his mailbox. A small sign that read, "No one can take him from me." It wasn't defiance written in anger. It was grief written in resolve. The HOA would come for him, he knew that. But he was no longer afraid of them. For the first time since Claire's death, Thomas had something worth fighting for. And in the stillness of that morning, as the oak tree swayed and Max barked softly at a passing car, the war between one man's heart and the HOA's power quietly began. The next week brought no peace to Willow Bend Lane. The HOA's machine had begun to move. Slow, methodical, relentless. Thomas Granger's simple act of compassion had triggered something deeper within the community. Something that revealed how fragile its harmony truly was. Each morning, a new envelope waited in his mailbox. Each one carried the same sharp language, the same sterile authority. Remove unauthorized pet immediately. The letters grew bolder, threatening escalating fines, mandatory hearings, and eventually legal eviction. At first, Thomas ignored them. He stacked the notices neatly on his desk, a silent wall of paper against the cold precision of the HOA. But they kept coming, one every other day, until the pile began to lean like a monument to defiance. The neighbors had started to notice. Some avoided his house entirely, turning their heads when they walked by. Others whispered in low voices about the man who couldn't follow simple rules. The image of Thomas as a quiet, grieving widower was being replaced by one of a stubborn troublemaker. But not everyone saw it that way. Late one afternoon, as Thomas watered the patch of flowers Claire had once planted, a soft voice called from the sidewalk. It was Sarah, the young woman who lived 3 houses down. She'd moved in only a few months earlier, a nurse who worked long shifts at the hospital. She smiled gently, her eyes flicking toward the small dog chasing his tail in the yard. She didn't say much, but her nod told Thomas something. He wasn't completely alone. Still, isolation crept in. Max seemed to sense his unease, curling closer to him each night as though to guard him from the world outside. But peace was fleeting. 2 weeks after the first letter, Thomas woke to find an orange notice taped to his front door. It was larger, bolder, unmistakable. Final enforcement notice. HOA inspection scheduled. His stomach turned. They were coming. That afternoon, Thomas sat at the dining table surrounded by letters, documents, and his fading patience. He remembered the old HOA meetings he'd once attended with Claire, back when Linda Barker's voice carried authority and the community still believed in her sense of order. But even then, there had been tension. A long time ago, there had been a tragedy. Thomas barely remembered the details. Something about a child's allergic reaction, a neighbor's dog, and a lawsuit that had nearly bankrupted the association. The aftermath had led to the current rule. No pets allowed. Ever. It had seemed reasonable back then. Now it felt cruelly ironic. The HOA's fear of loss had turned into obsession with control. And now, years later, Thomas was paying the price for it. As the sun dipped below the roofs, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. 3 HOA board members stepped out. Linda Barker leading, clipboard in hand, flanked by her loyal officers. Peter, the treasurer with a face like carved stone, and Rachel, the secretary whose nervous smile masked her disapproval. Thomas opened the door before they could knock. Their visit was brief and impersonal. Linda spoke in a tone so smooth it could cut glass. She reminded him of Section 14B of the HOA bylaws, outlining penalties for violations, including removal of property and, if necessary, termination of residency. Thomas didn't argue. He simply stood there, quiet but unyielding. When Linda asked if he understood the consequences, he nodded once, his jaw tight. Then she gestured toward Max, sitting silently by the couch. For a brief second, something flickered in her eyes. Something human. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "This is your last chance," she said. When they left, the house fell silent again. But the silence felt different now. Not grief, not fear. Something heavier. Determination. That night, Thomas sat in Claire's old chair with Max sleeping in his lap. He looked out at the rain starting again, just like the night he found the puppy. It felt symbolic somehow, the beginning of another storm. He decided to act. If they wanted to dig into his life, he'd dig into theirs. He began researching the HOA's history, combing through old newsletters, archived minutes, and community records that most people had long forgotten. That's when he found it, an old entry buried in the association's meeting notes from 7 years ago. A dog named Daisy, a little girl named Emily, an accident that ended in tragedy. The line that followed chilled him. Effective immediately, the HOA board unanimously votes to ban all pets. Emotional considerations must never outweigh community safety. Thomas leaned back, his pulse steady but cold. The words were cruel in their clarity. But behind them he could feel the echo of pain, the kind of pain that hardened into rules. He looked down at Max, whose ears twitched in sleep. The HOA wasn't just enforcing policy. They were enforcing grief. Someone else's, buried beneath paperwork and bylaws. And Thomas realized something he hadn't before. The battle wasn't just about a dog. It was about healing a wound the neighborhood had refused to face. As lightning cracked outside, Thomas made a quiet promise to himself. He wouldn't just fight to keep Max. He'd uncover the truth behind the rule that had stolen so much compassion from Willow Bend Lane. The letters might multiply, but so would his resolve. And somewhere in the still night, as rain pattered on the window, the faint echo of a child's laughter seemed to whisper through the storm. A memory the HOA had tried too hard to forget. The next morning, the air in Willow Bend felt heavier, as though the storm had left something behind. The streets were clean, the lawns manicured, and the houses stood in perfect formation. Yet beneath that polish, Thomas could sense the weight of buried memories. He had spent most of the night reading through HOA records, his laptop surrounded by half-empty coffee mugs and stacks of printouts. What began as curiosity had turned into obsession. He wasn't just looking for a loophole anymore. He was looking for answers. The minutes from that fateful year were fragmented and oddly edited. Certain pages were missing, others heavily redacted. But what he managed to piece together told a grim story, a story the HOA wanted forgotten. It had started with the Henderson family, who lived just 2 streets away. Their daughter, Emily, had been only 6 years old. She loved animals, and one day, their neighbor's dog, Daisy, a gentle golden retriever, got loose and wandered into the Hendersons' yard. No one knew exactly what happened next, but the report claimed Emily suffered a severe allergic reaction to dog dander. She was rushed to the hospital, but she didn't make it. The tragedy shattered the community. Grief quickly turned to blame, and the HOA, under mounting pressure from devastated parents and angry residents, responded with policy. They banned all pets. No exceptions. At first glance, it seemed like a reaction born from sorrow. But as Thomas dug deeper, the timeline didn't add up. The new regulation had been pushed through unusually fast, within days. And the proposal had been championed by one person. Linda Barker, the same woman now running the HOA with ruthless efficiency. Thomas leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Linda had been vice president back then. And buried in an old newsletter, he found a detail that froze him. Emily Henderson was Linda's niece. The realization changed everything. This wasn't just about rules or control. For Linda, it was personal. The HOA's coldness, its obsession with perfection. It all stemmed from her guilt. But instead of healing, she had turned that guilt into law. Her grief had hardened into policy, punishing anyone who dared to break it. Thomas sat in silence, staring at the screen. He understood grief, he had lived it. When Claire died, the world lost its color. But he hadn't tried to control it. He had learned to live beside it. Linda, on the other hand, had built a fortress of order to keep chaos and pain at bay. The deeper he read, the more the pieces fell into place. Old comments from board members mentioned disagreements, emotional instability, and even a resignation dispute. It seemed not everyone had supported the pet ban, but those who spoke against it had quietly disappeared from the records. Thomas realized that somewhere, someone might still remember the truth. He remembered one name that appeared briefly in an early meeting note: Charles Whitmore, the former HOA president before Linda took over. A retired architect, he had lived near the cul-de-sac at the far end of the community. According to the last update, He had resigned shortly after the incident. That afternoon, Thomas decided to find him. The sky was a pale gray, clouds stretching thin like paper. Max trotted beside him, tail wagging as they walked down the familiar path. Each house looked the same. Identical siding, trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes. The illusion of harmony hid the fractures beneath. When Thomas reached the end of Willow Bend, he found a house that stood slightly apart. Not by location, but by character. The paint was faded, the lawn overgrown, and a faint for sale sign leaned against the porch. Yet, through the dusty window he could see signs of life. He knocked once, then again. An older man eventually opened the door, thin, white-haired, wearing glasses too large for his face. His eyes were tired but sharp, like someone who had seen too much. Charles Whitmore. Thomas introduced himself briefly and mentioned the HOA. The old man's expression tightened instantly. Though he said little, the silence between them spoke volumes. Charles hesitated, then slowly gestured for Thomas to come in. Inside, the air smelled of dust and memories. Framed photos lined the walls. Smiling families, HOA events, neighborhood barbecues that seemed like relics from a different era. Thomas explained what he had discovered, his voice steady but urgent. Charles listened without interrupting. When he finally spoke, his tone was low and sorrowful. He confirmed what Thomas had feared. The HOA's no pets rule had not just been about safety, it had been about control. After Emily's death, Linda had used her influence to override opposition, insisting that emotional decisions endangered the community. When Charles resisted, she rallied the board against him. Within months, he was forced out. But there was something else, a piece of the story no one knew. Charles revealed that the official story of Emily's death had been simplified. The allergic reaction was real but incomplete. Emily hadn't died from exposure alone. There had been an accident, a fall from the porch while the adults argued about the dog. It was tragic but preventable. The dog attack narrative had been built to deflect blame, and it had stuck. Thomas felt the room spin. All these years, the HOA had been enforcing a lie. Linda Barker's grief had become dogma, and the community had paid for her silence. When Thomas left, the sun was setting behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the perfect lawns. The world around him seemed too calm for what he now knew. Max trotted beside him, unaware of the storm his presence had stirred. Thomas realized he couldn't stay silent anymore. But confronting Linda would require more than anger. It would require precision. She had power, influence, and fear on her side. He had truth, and a little dog who had reminded him that compassion still mattered. As night fell, he began drafting a letter, not a response to the HOA, but a statement to the entire community. He'd expose what had been buried for years. But he knew the cost would be high, because people like Linda didn't just defend rules, they became them. And breaking them meant breaking the illusion that held Willow Bend together. The next morning, Willow Bend Lane woke to a quiet disruption. Not the kind that shattered windows or blared through sirens, but the kind that spread in whispers, subtle and unstoppable. Thomas Granger had mailed his letter to every homeowner in the neighborhood. Not through official channels, not through HOA approval, but through simple, old-fashioned envelopes slipped into mailboxes before dawn. Inside each one was a single page, calm, factual, and devastating. It detailed the truth about the no pets policy, the history of Emily Henderson's tragedy, and the emotional manipulation that had followed. There was no bitterness in Thomas's words, only honesty. He wrote about how pain, when left unhealed, can turn into cruelty disguised as order. By mid-morning, the community buzzed like a disturbed hive. Neighbors gathered in driveways, clutching letters, exchanging disbelief. For years, they had accepted the pet ban as a necessary rule, a protective measure. Now, they were realizing it had been built on grief, deception, and one woman's unwillingness to face the truth. Linda Barker heard about it before breakfast. Her phone lit up with calls from board members, angry and panicked. She didn't answer any of them at first. She stood in her kitchen, the letter unfolded on the counter, reading Thomas's words over and over again. Her face remained composed, but her hand trembled slightly. The truth had slipped through the walls she'd built, and now it was in everyone's hands. That afternoon, she called an emergency HOA meeting. Residents filled the clubhouse hall, their voices rising in confusion, curiosity, and, for some, anger. Thomas attended quietly, sitting in the back corner, his presence enough to draw glares from the board. Max was not with him this time. He'd left the dog safely at home, aware that his simple existence had become a symbol of rebellion. When the meeting began, Linda spoke first. Her voice was steady, practiced. She dismissed Thomas's claims as misunderstandings and distortions. She reminded everyone of the tragic loss that had inspired the rule and insisted that the ban had always been about safety and compassion. But the crowd was restless. People who had lived there for decades began to question her authority. Why had certain meeting records gone missing? Why were fines so aggressively enforced? Why had she hidden behind a rule instead of letting the community heal? The questions came faster than Linda could answer. Peter, the HOA treasurer, shifted uncomfortably. Rachel, the secretary, stared down at her clipboard, unable to meet anyone's eyes. It was becoming clear that the story Thomas had uncovered wasn't just rumor. It was truth that had been deliberately buried. Thomas stood when the murmurs reached their peak. The room fell quiet as he walked slowly to the front, holding a copy of his letter. His voice was low, calm, unshaken. He didn't attack. He simply spoke about loss, his own and Linda's. He told them about finding Max on that rainy night, about how the dog had filled the silence that grief leaves behind. Then he spoke about Emily, about the truth Charles Whitmore had revealed, and about how pain can twist even the best intentions into something cruel. Every word was measured, deliberate, spoken not with anger but empathy. By the time he finished, the hall was silent. Even Linda, who had braced herself to fight, found herself unable to speak. Something in Thomas's tone, the quiet sincerity of it, cracked the armor she'd worn for years, but she couldn't show it. Not yet. She cleared her throat and announced that the HOA would review the claims and issue an official statement. Then she ended the meeting abruptly and walked out, her heels echoing sharply against the tile floor. The crowd didn't disperse right away. People lingered, talking softly, exchanging new truths with each other. Some approached Thomas, offering quiet thanks. Others, still fearful of the HOA's power, avoided eye contact. But one thing was clear, the illusion of order had shattered. That evening, Thomas returned home and found a small envelope on his porch. No address, no name. Inside was a single line written in neat handwriting. "You don't know what you've done." No signature. But Thomas knew who had sent it. It didn't frighten him, saddened him, because behind those words wasn't a threat, it was fear. Linda Barker had spent years building her power on silence, and now that silence was gone. Over the next few days, everything began to shift. The HOA board members were at odds. Neighbors whispered openly about recalling the current leadership, and for the first time, people started walking their dogs again. Unofficially, quietly, as though reclaiming something human. Thomas watched from his window as a young couple strolled past with a beagle on a leash. The sight made him smile. Small changes, but meaningful ones. Yet he knew the fight wasn't over. Linda Barker wasn't the type to surrender. The next move would be hers, and if he had learned anything from his research, it was that she would fight not to protect the HOA, but to protect herself from the truth. That truth was heavier than any rulebook, and now that it had been unearthed, it demanded reckoning. As night fell over Willow Bend, Thomas sat by the window with Max asleep beside him. In the distance, the clubhouse lights burned long past midnight. Somewhere inside, Linda Barker was still at her desk, surrounded by papers and memories she couldn't erase. And Thomas knew, the real confrontation was still to come. Days turned into weeks, but the tension inside Willow Bend didn't fade. It simmered. The neighborhood that once prided itself on perfect lawns and cheerful small talk now felt divided down invisible lines. Some stood with Thomas, believing his courage had freed them from an unfair rule. Others, fearful of chaos, still clung to Linda Barker's authority. The HOA had become silent, publicly at least. The board meetings were postponed. The usual newsletters stopped. But beneath that quiet surface, a storm was gathering strength. Thomas sensed it coming. He went about his days as normally as he could. Mornings spent walking Max, afternoons tending to Claire's old garden, evenings reading on the porch. It was a peaceful rhythm, one that felt borrowed, like calm before a reckoning. He noticed that Linda's SUV passed by his house more often now. Slowly, deliberately, like a predator studying its prey. She didn't stop, but he could feel her gaze even from behind the tinted windows. It wasn't hatred that lingered in her eyes. It was something deeper, wounded pride. Then, one evening, the calm shattered. It began with a notice slipped under his door. HOA emergency inspection, property violation. He knew what it meant. They were coming again, this time not to talk, but to act. The next morning, 3 board members arrived unannounced, accompanied by a uniformed community officer. It wasn't police, but it might as well have been. The symbolism was clear: authority, power, compliance. They claimed the HOA had received multiple complaints about sanitation and disturbances caused by a pet. Lies, of course. No one had ever complained about Max. But Thomas said nothing. He simply stood by as they walked through his yard, taking photos, noting imaginary violations. Linda arrived last, holding her clipboard like a shield. For the first time, Thomas saw her differently. Not as the cold, controlling figure she projected, but as someone exhausted by her own walls. Her eyes had lost the fire of certainty. They burned now with fatigue. Years of holding herself together under the weight of tragedy had drained her. When she saw Max sitting quietly on the porch steps, something in her expression faltered. The little dog tilted his head, wagged his tail once, and let out a soft sound. Not a bark, just a greeting. Linda froze. For a moment her mask cracked. Thomas caught it. The flash of pain, the memory that had been buried for years. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. Still, she lifted her chin, regained composure, and handed him a document. Final enforcement action. He unfolded it after she left. It was an official demand for pet removal. Failure to comply would result in fines and eviction proceedings. That night, Thomas sat in his dimly lit living room, the letter on the table beside him. Max slept at his feet. The weight of the HOA's cruelty pressed heavy on him. But there was something else underneath. Something resolute. He had exposed the truth, but truth alone hadn't changed the system. The rules were still in place, the penalties still written in stone. To win, he had to do more than reveal history, he had to heal it. The next morning, Thomas visited someone he hadn't seen since the letter went public, Charles Whitmore. The old man opened the door before Thomas even knocked, as if expecting him. They talked for hours, piecing together what came next. Charles still had documents, old records, vote tallies, and memos that proved Linda's manipulation of the HOA charter. Evidence that could legally void the no pets clause. But Thomas didn't want revenge through bureaucracy. He wanted redemption for everyone. Even Linda. When he left Charles's house, he made a decision that would either destroy his standing completely or finally break the chain that bound Willow Bend to the past. He planned a gathering, not an official meeting, but a community memorial. Not for his wife, not for himself, but for Emily Henderson. He printed flyers, quietly leaving them on porches. Remembering Emily, a walk for healing. It read, "All neighbors welcome, pets too." Word spread quickly, faster than any HOA notice ever had. Some ignored it, some tore the flyer in half, but many came. On the evening of the memorial, the sun hung low, painting the sky gold. Dozens of neighbors gathered near the community park, the very one where the HOA held their meetings. Children played quietly, couples held hands, and for the first time, dogs on leashes dotted the crowd. Thomas stood near a small framed photo of Emily, borrowed from Charles's archive. A candle flickered beside it. He spoke softly, not to accuse but to remember, about empathy, about love, about the danger of letting pain harden into rules. When he finished, silence fell. People were crying. Even those who had once defended the HOA's policy stood with heads bowed. And then, through the quiet crowd, Linda Barker appeared. She didn't come to lead, nor to stop them. She came alone, walking slowly, her face pale in the fading light. When her eyes met the photo of her niece, her composure broke entirely. For years, she had hidden behind regulations, believing that structure could protect her from memory. But here, surrounded by the very neighbors she had controlled, she finally allowed herself to grieve. Tears slipped down her face as she placed her clipboard on the ground beside the candle. A small, symbolic surrender. The moment passed softly, like wind through trees. No speeches, no applause, just shared silence, honest, painful, healing. That night, Willow Bend felt different. The streets were quiet, but the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, clean, peaceful, new. Thomas returned home with Max trotting beside him, his heart heavy but lightened somehow. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Fines, hearings, maybe worse, but it no longer mattered. Something greater had shifted. And deep down, he suspected that Linda Barker's war with the world was ending. Not because she was defeated, but because she finally remembered what it meant to be human. The morning that began with thunder carried a strange peace in the air. It was the kind of day that felt like an ending and a beginning all at once. The heavy clouds hovered low above the cul-de-sac, and the HOA's neat lawns glistened with raindrops. Michael sat by the window with Buddy curled up beside him. The small dog had grown weaker lately, his energy fading. Yet, in his quiet presence, the house still felt alive. Something it hadn't felt for years after Sarah's death. Michael had become a different man over the past few months. The fight against the HOA had changed him, but not in the way he'd expected. He had started by resisting out of anger, wanting to prove them wrong. But somewhere along the line, his cause became something deeper, a symbol for compassion, for humanity in a world obsessed with control and perfection. When the news spread that the HOA was calling for a vote to rewrite the No Pets clause, residents divided. Some had come to see Buddy as a harmless soul, a creature that brought smiles and unity to the neighborhood. Others clung to rules like a shield, afraid that bending even one might open the floodgates of chaos. On the day of the meeting, the rain poured harder, washing away the carefully chalked parking lines and flooding the pristine garden beds. Michael arrived at the HOA hall holding Buddy wrapped in a blanket. The murmurs grew loud. Some smiled softly, others whispered judgment. At the head table sat Helen, the same woman whose rigidity had caused so much pain. But even she looked different now. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her papers. She avoided Michael's gaze, but her expression carried exhaustion rather than hostility. When it was his turn to speak, Michael didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, holding Buddy gently. The dog's small head peeked out, eyes reflecting the light in the room. Michael spoke of loss, of how Buddy wasn't just a pet, but a connection to love, a bridge to healing. He spoke of rules that made sense on paper but forgot the human heart behind every home. As he spoke, something shifted in the room. Neighbors who once complained about dog fur or barking now looked down, remembering the loneliness of their own homes. Even Helen's eyes glistened, her lips pressing into a thin, uncertain line. When the vote was finally called, hands went up slowly, cautiously. The decision was close, painfully close. But in the end, the new amendment passed. Pets would be allowed under compassionate circumstances. The words themselves were small, but the meaning behind them felt enormous. Michael thanked no one. He simply sat down, holding Buddy tighter as the crowd dispersed. The victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt solemn, earned through quiet persistence and shared humanity. Weeks later, Buddy passed away peacefully in his sleep. Michael buried him beneath the oak tree in his backyard, marking the spot with a small stone. The house felt emptier again, but not hollow. There was peace now, the kind that comes when wounds finally close. Few days after the funeral, Helen knocked on his door for the first time. She stood there in the drizzle, holding a small photo in her hand. A picture of a little boy with a golden retriever. "My son," she said softly, her voice breaking. "We lost him to an accident." I couldn't bear to see another dog on this street after that. Michael understood then. The cruel rules, the cold enforcement, the relentless need for order. It had all come from grief. They had both been grieving in different ways, and both had hidden it behind silence and walls. He didn't say a word. He just nodded and invited her in for tea. From that day on, the neighborhood changed. Children played with pets on sidewalks. Fences no longer felt like barriers, and neighbors smiled more often. Michael often sat on his porch, watching them with quiet satisfaction. The HOA still existed, but now it felt more like a community, a place where people lived, not just followed rules. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Helen joined him on the porch. She looked older, gentler. "You know," she said, "I think he would have liked Buddy." Michael smiled faintly. They probably would have been friends. The rain began again, soft and cleansing, tapping gently on the wooden railings. For the first time in years, Michael didn't feel alone. The rule that once symbolized pain had become the start of healing, for both him and the neighborhood. And as the storm clouds drifted away, revealing a quiet sky streaked with orange light, the sign at the entrance of the neighborhood was changed. No longer just "No pets allowed." Now it read, "Welcome home." The words glowed faintly in the damp evening air, a small but powerful symbol of what they had all learned, that sometimes compassion is the only rule that matters.